Bandicoot. At last, I, the great Neocortex, have you right where I want you. And now, the final blow!
Hush, simpleton.
The Crash Bandicoot series is quite beloved by many, with the first couple of games on the PlayStation 1, such as the original Trilogy and Team Racing, being remembered fondly by many, with the former's tight platforming and difficult level design having quite a differing appeal as that of its alternatives such as Mario, Sonic and Spyro the Dragon. Since then, the series has mostly been in a state of mediocrity, up until Activision attempted to revitalise the series with the release of the Crash NSane Trilogy, developed by Vicarious Visions, and Team Racing Nitro Fuel, developed by Beanox, which both were resounding successes, bringing to attention the demand for a new Crash Bandicoot game instead of just a remake, which was recently presented to us in the form of Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. Crash 4 was published by Activision and developed by multiple studios, primarily Toys for Bob, the developers behind the amazing Spyro Reignited trilogy from a few years back. Secondary studios that worked on Crash 4 include Beanox, the developers behind the also amazing Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, as well as Activision Shanghai, who previously worked on the China exclusive Call of Duty Online. The game, despite being called Crash 4, is actually the 8th mainline entry in the series, with the last entry, Mind Over Mutant, releasing 12 years ago to an overall fairly mediocre critical and commercial response, which resulted in a large hiatus for the series that only recently came to an end with 2017's Crash NSane Trilogy, which remade the original 3 Crash games with modern visuals in order to bring the series back into the public eye, with resounding success. Crash Bandicoot 4, as the name suggests, acts both narratively and in terms of gameplay as a sequel to the original Crash Trilogy, with the story taking place after the events of Crash 3 Warped, and largely ignoring the events of sequels such as The Wrath of Cortex and other later games. Gameplay wise, it for the most part plays like you'd expect a sequel to the original trilogy to play, with Crash traversing through levels horizontally and vertically, smashing crates, killing enemies and dying in a multitude of various ways along the way, complete with chase levels where you must escape something or ride something to the end of the level. Crash 4 very much feels iterative of the original games as a result, but it does include several unique gameplay features that make it feel fresh and new, such as new playable characters in the form of Dr. Neocortex, Dingodale, and an alternate universe version of Torna Bandicoot, as well as several new abilities in the form of quantum masks that are utilised in certain Crash levels to add extra gameplay gimmicks, such as slowing time, phasing platforms in and out of existence, and so on. Crash Bandicoot 4 released on October 2nd, 2020 to a really positive critical reception, with an overall average Metacritic review score of 85 out of 100 for the PS4 version of the game from 69 critic reviews. OpenCritic, another review score aggregator site, also lists Crash 4 as having an overall average review score of 85 in general, with praise consisting of the game incorporating a wide variety of modern gameplay mechanics and utilising them to improve and modernise the original Crash gameplay formula, as well as the stunning visuals and overall level design. I, like many others, grew up with the Crash series, playing through the original games for my PlayStation 1 as a toddler, then playing through Twinsanity and Crash of the Titans on my PS2 as a child, and then a few years ago with the NSane Trilogy and Team Racing Nitro Fueled on the PS4 as an adult. It's a series that has been with me since the start in a way, and as such it's quite important to me for personal reasons. So the question is, what did I think about Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time? Does it reinvent the original Crash formula in new and interesting ways, or is it stale, underwhelming and unimaginative? Well, watch on and find out, as I'll be dissecting each and every part of the game from the general story, gameplay, graphics and audio, even going as far as to list and give my thoughts on the completion rewards and how attainable they are, before concluding with my overall opinion of the game in general. For the purposes of this review, I played the game on the PlayStation 4 Pro, to full story completion including every main and side level, though I'm still attempting to go for full completion, but considering just how difficult and time consuming the game is to fully complete, it might be a couple months of pain and suffering before I can come even close. So let's get into this review and see if Crash 4 is a worthy successor to that which came before it, and if it manages to take full advantage of the anticipation set up by the Crash NSane Trilogy and Team Racing remakes for a new Crash game to the same or higher degree of quality. The story of the game acts as a sequel to Crash 3 Warped's true ending, where Dr. Neo Cortex and Dr. Entropy were turned into infants and trapped alongside the mask Uka Uka far in the past, with Crash 4 opening up to them having grown back to their original ages after several decades of attempting to escape their imprisonment. Uka Uka manages to tear open a hole in reality seemingly at the cost of his own life, allowing for Entropy and Cortex to escape and plan their next attempts at world domination, utilising the cracks in time created by Uka Uka to bend time to their whims, with the help of Dr. N Jin and Dr. N Brio. Meanwhile, Crash is awakened by Aku Aku, who senses the disturbances caused by all of this, and so Crash heads off with his sister Coco to try and save the day. Crash soon finds the first of the Quantum Masks, Lani Loli, who tasks Crash and Coco with finding the other Quantum Masks, whilst combating any evildoers attempting to take advantage of the rifts. Whilst on their adventure, Crash and Coco meet up with other playable characters, such as Crash Bandicoot, an alternate timeline version of Crash's girlfriend from the first game, who in her timeline is more of a badass action hero on her own adventure to save the day. Dingodaw is another character integral to the story, who has retired from a life of villainy since Crash 3 and has opened up his own restaurant, but gets dragged into the adventure when a rival restaurant chain burns his business down and he is sucked into another dimension by the timeline rifts. Cortex himself also joins the team at a certain point in the game, but I won't go further into the narrative reasons for him joining, as I don't want to spoil his involvement in the story, as it's quite a fun and interesting story thread. In terms of their involvement in the narrative, the other playable characters don't really interact with Crash and Coco directly for the most part, aside from their first introductions and near the end of the game, but most of the levels that you do play as them coincide and offer a second perspective on some of the levels where you do play as Crash and Coco, which I thought was really cool and helps to make the story feel a bit bigger than it actually is. The story itself, in terms of quality, is pretty great for the most part, with a very Saturday morning cartoon feel in terms of the tone and pacing, with plenty of well animated cutscenes that push the story forward whilst developing the characters. The dialogue as well was pretty well written, with some excellent comedic moments and characterization, with each of the characters, including the masks and villains, coming off as likeable and fairly well developed for their involvement in the story.
I've got a reward for the clever bandicoots who can reach my testing grounds, but you'll have to defeat my deadly, diabolical creations along the way.
It's a story that won't win any awards or anything, and it's fairly simple in its premise and resolution, but for a platformer like Crash that's perfectly fine, and it does its job of getting the player from point A to point B in an enjoyable and encouraging manner well enough. The story of Crash 4 is probably the best in the series so far, which admittedly isn't saying much considering how light most of the games are when it comes to the story, but it does a great job at keeping the player engaged as you go through the levels, as the colourful dialogue and likeable characters help to make the story enjoyable and fun to progress through. Now onto the gameplay of Crash Bandicoot 4, which initially feels very similar to its predecessors, with simple yet fun platforming that slowly becomes more and more complex as you progress, with several interesting new additions here and there, as well as extra playable characters that shake the classic Crash formula up enough to prevent it all from becoming stale and tedious. For the most part, the levels are constructed similarly to how levels in the original Crash Trilogy were constructed, with an interesting hybrid of 2D and 3D platforming that has you running either horizontally and vertically on a 2D plane, or in all directions in a 3D plane, traversing platforms, evading enemies and avoiding obstacles in order to reach the end, whilst attempting to destroy as many crates along the way. The two main playable characters in the game are Crash Bandicoot and his sister Coco, the latter of which becomes playable after completion of the first two levels in the game, and you're free to swap between the two of them whenever you want on the map screen. Both Crash and Coco function the same in terms of moveset, and only really differ in terms of appearance. Personally, I played through most of the game as Coco due to preferring how some of the unlockable alternate skins looked on her compared to Crash, but you can play as either character to progress the story just the same, and it won't affect anything narratively or in terms of gameplay. The levels where you play as Crash and Coco are the most common in the game, and as such have the most varied skill sets in terms of the gameplay mechanics you'll be using to complete them. Firstly, Crash can jump and double jump to traverse the world, as well as slide to avoid certain obstacles. Crouching or sliding immediately before jumping allows you to leap higher, and whilst not really essential in the early game, quickly becomes important when you reach the later levels, as well as when attempting time trials where speed and precision become all the more important. You can also jump and perform a ground pound maneuver in order to destroy certain crates, and Crash also has his signature spin attack that can be used to defeat most of the enemies in the game, as well as destroy most of the crates as well. All in all, it's the classic Crash gameplay you expect to see, but refined to feel as good to control as possible, with new jumping physics that feel very much more intuitive than that of the NSane trilogy, and the collision detection, whilst not perfect, is vastly improved compared to previous entries, leading to less unfair deaths and an overall more consistent positive experience. The core Crash gameplay isn't just about rehashing and refining the original gameplay formula though, as the gameplay becomes a bit more complex when factoring in each of the different quantum masks that you can obtain over the course of your journey, which when collected during a level are used to traverse those levels in slightly more complex ways. For example, the first mask you obtain, Lani Loli, has the ability to shift objects between dimensions, which you'll use for light puzzle platforming sections where you'll need to shift to get across different platforms and eliminate certain hazards. The second mask, Akano, is slightly less complex, with his ability being that he can make you endlessly spin, allowing for you to glide to further platforms, as well as break boxes that you'd normally have to ground pound to destroy, though making TNT crates more of a danger, adding a layer of challenge when handling that mask's mechanics. Capunoir, the third mask, has the ability to slow down time, which as expected for such a power you'll use to slow down platforms and enemies in order to get past them, though time is only slowed for a few seconds, meaning you'll have to rush across the slowed platforms quickly before the mask's powers wear off. Finally there's Ika Ika, who can flip gravity, turning the ground into the ceiling and vice versa at the press of a button, which becomes one of the more complicated mechanics to deal with during some of the later levels in the game, where you'll often need to switch gravity to get high enough to overcome one obstacle, but then quickly switch gravity back again to avoid another obstacle. All of these masks are fun to use, and at least from my perspective add an interesting new flavour to the basic Crash formula that works surprisingly well, and manages to rejuvenate and diversify the basic Crash gameplay to make it slightly more complex and interesting, yet not to the point where it becomes confusing and overly complicated. There are several other playable characters that show up as you progress through the game aside from just Crash and Coco as well. These characters are introduced in their own levels as part of the main story, and once completed are mostly relegated to side timeline levels that branch off from the main story levels and narratively connect to the levels that they are adjacent to, offering a glimpse at what the other playable characters are doing as Crash and Coco are traversing the main levels. These levels are fine for the most part, but the fact that halfway through the timeline level you switch back to Crash and Coco to do the second half of the level, which is just a very slightly remixed version of the adjacent main story level, is honestly a little disappointing, as it makes the secondary characters feel a little pointless due to the lack of many full levels in which you can play as them, which is a real shame because each of the characters have really fun playstyles that change the core gameplay up quite a bit, and it would have been nice to play as them for a bit longer than you do in the main game. In terms of the secondary characters themselves, the first you encounter during the story is an alternate version of Torna Bandicoot, who is from a timeline where she's the hero and is on her own quest to save the day. Torna shares some similar gameplay mechanics as Crash and Coco, such as the ground pound and a variation on the spin attack. However, she differs in the sense that she can use a grappling hook to destroy crates or enemies from a distance, or swing across an area, as well as wall jump on certain walls to progress further into the level. Torna's levels for the most part are quite fun and are pretty cool initially, offering a nice change from the standard Crash gameplay, though from my experience some of her unique moves such as the grapple hook and the wall jump can be a bit finicky at times and don't always work as intended, which can be infuriating when attempting to fully complete a level for 106% completion. Her levels as well feel a bit lacking in terms of overall design too, as the wall jumping platforms and grappling hooks, while initially interesting, don't really change up gameplay much, as they're mostly automated mechanics that don't really influence the minute-to-minute gameplay like with the other characters' unique gameplay mechanics. In terms of gameplay then, she's probably my least favourite to play as, because of the issues I mentioned, and it's a real shame, because in terms of her aesthetical design and personality, she's probably my favourite character in the game as a whole, but on a gameplay front, she's kinda underwhelming. The next playable character you encounter is Dingodale, a former antagonist of Crash and Coco's who retired from villainy to start his own restaurant. Dingodale is a really interesting character in terms of his moveset, as aside from his spin attack, almost his entire moveset differs from Crash and Coco. He cannot ground pound and he also cannot double jump. Instead he can jump and then use his vacuum gun to hover and do a delayed second jump. He can also use his vacuum gun to suck up crates, including TNT crates, which he can then use to fire as a projectile to destroy obstacles and enemies in his path. In my opinion, I found Dingodale's levels to be some of the best in terms of level design, as a lot of the obstacles and their placement work really well with Dingodale's moveset. He also feels quite unique to play as compared to everyone else, and I couldn't really find many flaws with his mechanics, making for quite a fun change from the normal levels. Finally, there are the Cortex levels, where you play as the series villain Dr. Neo Cortex. Cortex mechanically is a really interesting character because unlike everyone else, he doesn't have a close range melee attack. Instead he has a blaster which he can use to turn enemies into regular or bouncy platforms in order to progress. Cortex also has a dash instead of a double jump, which allows for him to travel further than most characters, but not as high. The levels where you play as Cortex are interesting because they definitely feel slower and more focused on type puzzle platforming than the main levels do, and that's completely fine as all of Cortex's unique abilities work well with that playstyle, and offer, just like with Dingodale stages, a lot of variety compared to the regular levels, so it all comes together quite nicely. So yeah, overall each character functions quite differently, and the new additions of the Quantum Masks really do change things up enough that it makes the core Crash gameplay feel fresh and new, yet still iterative of the classic Crash formula that we know and love. That being said, not everything about the game's mechanics are flawless. For one, the game has some really nasty issues when it comes to determining depth, both in 2D and 3D platforming segments, leading to some very unfair deaths as you fail to make a jump or misjudge an enemy, crate or platform's placement. There is an option in the menu that adds a small circle underneath you to help tell whether you're currently above a platform or not, and while it definitely does help, it's not a solution that really solves the problem, especially during certain sections where you've got to be quick with your platforming. Even though earlier I said it was better than the collision detection in NSane Trilogy, the collision detection in Crash 4 can be a bit iffy as well, in particular during 2D platforming sections where you can still move around in a 3D space, as you can sometimes get caught on the walls if you're too close to them when jumping, which almost always leads to death and is never a fair or fun feeling when it happens. None of these flaws are particularly game breaking though, and are only slight annoyances for the most part when progressing with the game normally. They're absolutely anger inducing and frustrating if you're attempting to 106% complete the game though, as you'll find the depth issues and general gameplay imperfections to really be an issue when trying to get through each stage without dying, or when attempting the Platinum Time Trial Relics.
Alright, all you bloodthirsty lunatics, put your freaky little hands together for Rocket Head!
game also has a couple boss fights over the course of the game, and they're all really fun and challenging, with multiple phases that get slightly more complex as you progress. Admittedly, there are only a few of them over the course of the game and they feel quite spaced out, but they're always a nice change of pace and greatly help to push the narrative forward when they do occur. In terms of difficulty, the game has two core options, Modern and Retro. These don't really alter the actual difficulty of the game itself, but instead change how the live system works. On Modern, you have infinite lives, and when you die you'll respawn at the nearest checkpoint, whereas on Retro you'll have a limited amount of lives, and if you run out, you'll get a game over and will have to start the level from the beginning. I personally played through the game on Retro, and from my experience the rate you get extra lives is just too quick to justify the separate live system options, as I was always close to the live cap of 99 no matter how many times I died, and I never got a game over throughout my entire time playing the game. The difficulty in the game itself mostly scales quite nicely as you progress further into the game, with the levels encountered at the start of the game being fairly easy with few complex obstacles, whereas the later levels ramp up the difficulty by putting all your skills to the test with some really nasty obstacle placements. The difficulty however ramps up to borderline impossible levels when you attempt to fully complete a level, as each level in the game has multiple different side objectives you can complete that require tons of luck and godlike skill to pull off, but I'll go into more detail on that later in this review when I discuss the full completion requirements for the game, as well as the rewards for doing so. Overall, the game's difficulty isn't too bad if you're just progressing through the game without full completion in mind, and you'll only really struggle with the last couple worlds in the game. But even then, it's a relatively steady climb in difficulty, so by the time you get there you'll probably have adapted to the controls enough to deal with it all anyway. In terms of playtime, it will probably take you about 10 to 20 hours to finish the game, dependent on your skill level, though if you do go for full completion that will balloon to way past 50 hours due to the immense skill, luck and time investment required for some of the things involved with completion. All in all, the gameplay for Crash 4 is for the most part really solid. The main gameplay with Crash and Coco is just as fun as it was all those years ago, perhaps even better considering the refinements made to it, and the new gameplay inclusions with the masks really change things up and keep things interesting, especially when combined with some of the excellent level designs and obstacle placements in certain levels that really makes progressing with the game a real joy. The other playable characters are also really nice and offer much more variety in terms of gameplay, whether you're grappling across areas with Torna, vacuuming crates and hovering across areas as Dingodale, or transforming enemies into platforms as Cortex. They all feel completely different to play as than Crash and Coco, and feel for the most part just as well developed in terms of the mechanics on offer. Sure, there are some flaws here and there that are a bit of a pain to experience, especially during a full completion run of the game, but thankfully none of those flaws are too intrusive or frequent to truly be a huge criticism, especially if they are patched and tweaked at some point post-release. It truly feels like in terms of gameplay, Crash 4 is definitely near the top of the list in terms of overall mechanical diversity, as well as overall enjoyment. Crash Bandicoot 4 visually is quite beautiful, with a new art style that leans further towards the cartoony aspects the series is known for, so the character models are a lot less realistically proportioned with larger heads on angular bodies, which works completely fine here as it allows for the models and their animations to look a lot more expressive and full of life, akin to that of a cartoon. The levels too are just as full of life as the characters, but not only because of the cartoony art style, but because of the amount of detail and action going on outside of the general play area. One of the levels that demonstrates this the most is the incredible New Orleans Festival themed level Offbeat, where everything has a very lively parade themed vibe, with the windows on the buildings in the background alternating between being lit and not, as large parade floats tower in the surroundings, and various colourful undead characters act as unintentional obstacles as they celebrate the festivities. It's one of the best levels in the game purely based on its aesthetics alone, and the character and life exuded by this level thankfully is consistent throughout most of the levels in the game, with each one managing to display tons of personality and charm without ever feeling overcrowded. The level variety in terms of theming is pretty impressive across the board too, and goes a long way to help keep the game's visual style fresh and interesting over the course of the entire game. There are about 10 different worlds, each ranging from about 2 to 5 levels, each of which have a general overall theme, with each level within doing something slightly unique with it. For example, going back to the offbeat level I mentioned before, which is the first level in its world, that level is immediately followed by a level set in a bayou, with plenty of marshes and rough-looking shacks, which is a huge change considering in the previous level you were running across colourful rooftops full of splendour and life. The level after that then attempts to blend both themes together to show how the gorgeous and rich city transitions into the rough and poverty-stricken bayou, which is cool in a world-building sense as it shows how visually multifaceted the world is, but also manages to diversify the aesthetical designs of the levels themselves to prevent a specific theme from overstaying its welcome. At a certain point of the game, you'll also unlock the ability to replay any level in the game in inverted mode, where the level layout is mirrored horizontally, and a special visual filter is placed on top of the art style, with each world having its own unique filter, I suppose as a way to make it feel like each world is a different dimension. These filters range from adding neon outlines to everything, or making everything white and making it so that spinning returns colour to the world. These inverted levels aren't different in a gameplay sense, but visually they feel like completely new levels in their own right, and the mirrored level layout helps to further exemplify that. I definitely highly recommend giving them a try if you can at the very least, as they're a fun new way to play the levels in the game. One slight downside to the game graphically, however, is that it runs at a dynamic resolution that caps at 1080p, even on PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X, which is a slight shame because with the visuals this good, a slightly better resolution would really help to make everything look a bit clearer, but it's not the biggest loss in the world. Performance-wise, however, the game for the most part consistently runs at 60 frames per second on PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, with an uncapped frame rate that dips between 60 and 30 constantly on base platforms. As I've established in other videos, I feel like an uncapped frame rate is always worse than a fixed frame rate, and since this game on base consoles is so sporadic with its frame rate, it's a little disappointing that there isn't an option to limit the frame rate to 30 frames per second on those systems, as the frame issues do aggravate some of the little gameplay issues I mentioned earlier. For a more detailed graphics and performance analysis, I highly recommend checking out the Digital Foundry video on Crash 4, which I'll link in the description, as they go into more depth with each platform's performance, as well as give a more advanced rundown of the graphical effects on display. Overall though, visually the game is pretty damn gorgeous, with a beautiful new art style that evokes personality through its use of animations in over-exaggerated proportions, with each new location and character fitting in with that art style perfectly, with excellent and consistent graphical fidelity throughout that utilises the capabilities of the Unreal Engine 4 engine to its limits, which, combined with excellent performance on both PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, really hits home that Crash is back, and better than ever. Though admittedly the performance on base platforms is a little disappointing, and while still perfectly playable, leads to a much more muted overall experience. It will however be interesting to see if the game receives any next generation enhancements for the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X in the future, and if so, what those enhancements will be in terms of improving performance and graphical fidelity further. On the topic of music and sound, the game sounds pleasant enough, utilising the same sound font as the Crash NSane Trilogy did, though in my opinion the soundtrack overall was fairly forgettable, with none of the tracks really standing out or featuring any memorable melodies to keep you interested. I'm not entirely sure if it's just my personal taste or just the sound font itself, but whilst the music is fine and you probably won't dislike any of the music in the game, you probably won't remember any of the tracks in the game either. Thankfully, the sound effects are on point, with everything from the crate smashing sounds to the explosions, blaster hits and death sounds. All of it audibly sounds pretty great and consistent in quality with the previous Crash games. Jumping on a crate has a lot of weight to it due to how satisfying it tends to break it and use it as a trampoline to progress. Voice acting is also on point for all the characters, at least in the English dub.
To the past, but all it did was give me more time to plan your doom. You'll find me up the mountain, don't freeze on the way!
Well, you know, I'm sensing a real fraught history here. How many times have you beaten this clown anyway?
3.
Really? Only 3? Funny. Seemed like more.
I'm not sure if the game features any other dubs or subs, as you cannot change them in any of the option menus, so they might be PlayStation region locked. Which is a bit of a shame, but it's not as big of a deal breaker as with games like this. Story is light and gameplay is a lot more important. But it's still a shame they couldn't invest in other localization options. The game does, however, have some great subtitle options when it comes to accessibility though, as you're able to change the font size, the opacity of the background behind the text, and so on, which is really cool, and I hope more games do this, as it's a really awesome thing to see. Overall, when it comes to audio, this is where the game's only real big flaws come into play. The soundtrack, whilst decent, is incredibly forgettable, potentially due to the limiting sound font they decided to use that, whilst the same as the NSane Trilogy, doesn't have the nostalgia to fall back on, so it just sounds dated and a bit lame. Though I will still say that the soundtrack is decent when going through the levels themselves, and you probably won't dislike any of them while you're listening to them. It's just you won't remember them afterwards, that's all. Crash Bandicoot 4, just like the games in the series before it, is packed full of various collectibles to collect and difficult trials to complete, perhaps even more so than any other game in the series. This time around, each level has 6 different gems to collect, 3 of which are collected by obtaining a certain percentage of the fruit in a level, 1 for dying less than 3 times, 1 for smashing all the boxes, and 1 which is hidden somewhere in the level. On top of that, each level has an insanely perfect relic, which is obtained by collecting all of the gems in a level except for the hidden one in one run without dying, which makes a full completion run of the game a drastically more challenging feat. Admittedly, the first couple levels aren't too difficult, but when you get to the later levels, especially the last world, it's borderline impossible. Then there are the time trial relics that can be obtained by completing each level's various time trial score requirements. The basic relic times for each level aren't too difficult to achieve, but the platinum relic times are, just like with every other Crash game that has them, absolute hell to complete, as you've really got to master your skills at the game in order to get through each level without dying, without checkpoints, and in optimal time. On top of that, some levels have collectible tapes that can only be obtained by reaching them without dying, which admittedly will probably come naturally to those already seeking to complete the insanely perfect relics for those levels anyway. But once collected, the tapes will unlock an area in the hub where you can play what are called Flashback Levels. These are short bonus levels set before the events of the very first Crash game that reward you with flashback relics depending on the percentage of crates you smashed in the level, with a platinum relic rewarded if you manage to smash all the crates in the flashback level. Coloured gems also make their return from past Crash games, with 4 of the levels in the game containing them in quite cryptic places. For example, the first gem you can obtain, the red gem, is found in the second level in the game by jumping on these platforms in a very specific pattern. Every level in the game can also be played in inverted mode once you get to a certain point in the game. These inverted levels also have 6 collectible gems, though thankfully they don't have insanely perfect relics attached, so you are free to die a couple times and obtain the gems in multiple runs of the level if need be. Suffice to say, obtaining full completion in Crash Bandicoot 4 is quite a tough and long ordeal, with many of the collectibles testing your skills at the game to their very limits. The question is though, why should you go to all these lengths to fully clear the game? Well, simply beating all the levels and bosses in the game rewards you with the game's first ending, as well as unlocks a triple spin, a move that can be used by Crash and Coco that is pretty vital for tackling the time trials in the game, as it has a nice speed boost to it. So it's a good idea to go through all the levels in the game first to unlock it before tackling the full completion run. Collecting a certain amount of gems in a level unlocks a new skin for Crash or Coco, which drastically alters their appearance, and all of the unlockable skins are pretty different enough that it makes completing the individual levels themselves all the more rewarding because of it. Reaching 100% completion rewards you with the game's epilogue, and reaching 106% completion rewards you with a secret ending on top of that, just like the original trilogy of Crash games did, which is probably the best reward you could receive for fully completing a game. However, with Crash 4, the list of requirements to reach either of those completion thresholds is so mind-numbingly difficult that unless you're some kind of Crash speedrunning god, or just incredibly dedicated, you're almost definitely never going to reach those endings yourself, and will probably have to resort to viewing them on YouTube. Crash 4, for the most part, is a manageable difficulty if you go through the game normally without thinking about completion, but as soon as you attempt full completion, suddenly you're thrust into one of the hardest platforming adventures you'll probably ever experience. As getting through each level completing every objective in one run without dying is challenging, as most of the levels in the game are quite long and a lot of the crates are well hidden, and if you miss just one, then you're screwed, and levels that have easily missable crates, like levels where you're riding something, are infuriating because those segments are always near the end of the levels and they're a little more cumbersome to control, so retrying and having to go all the way through the level just to try and fail again and again is a really mentally draining experience, especially considering it takes about 20 to 25 seconds sometimes to load back in on a retry. That's not even covering attempting the time trials for each level either, as the gold relic time, let alone the platinum relic times for every level, require absolute precise accuracy and minimal errors, as well as consistent use of the triple spin ability. It's easily the hardest challenge in the game, especially when you factor in how difficult the last couple levels in the game are to even finish, let alone complete. And considering there's about 38 main levels in total, that's a lot of time investment you've got to spend trying to perfect every level. Basically, unless you're an absolute hardcore Crash Bandicoot completionist or thrive on being given a challenge, I definitely advise against attempting to fully complete Crash Bandicoot 4, as it requires a ton of time investment, patience and latent skill to even stand a chance at coming anywhere close to completion. Altogether, Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is an excellent return to form for the series as a whole, continuing the degree of quality that the NSane Trilogy and Team Racing remakes brought, and elevating it to new levels with excellent gameplay, stunning visuals, decent music, and a story that, while simple, keeps you pushing forwards to see how it all plays out. The new playable characters all brought interesting new mechanics to the table, and the inclusion of the quantum masks does a great job of keeping the classic Crash formula fresh and engaging. With levels that are all visually unique and beautiful, the game does a great job of keeping you interested as you progress through it. Admittedly, there are a few minor gripes here and there when it comes to the gameplay, and the music, while decent, is admittedly quite forgettable. But what is here is overall a great experience, and easily one of the best games released this year because of that. With the next generation of consoles fast approaching, it will also be interesting to see how Crash transitions to the next generation, and maybe even see if Crash 4 itself receives any next gen enhancements that improve the game further. I can definitely say without a shadow of doubt that it's probably my new favourite Crash Bandicoot game, and I'm curious to see what they'll do next with the series. Will they continue with the gameplay format established with the original trilogy and was refined in Crash 4, or will they attempt to try the semi-open world format that Twinsanity brought to the table? Though, I think either way, for a while we won't be hearing much from the Orange Marsupial, as I think Activision are probably going to prioritise a new Spyro game over Crash next, since we've had 2 Crash games since the Spyro Trilogy remake. But that's all we have the time in this review. If you like this video or have your own thoughts on Crash 4, let me know in the comments below. I'm always interested in hearing what you think. Be sure to subscribe to my channel as well if you haven't, to ensure you always stay up to date with my current content. Until next time guys, this has been Kingdom H, and thanks for watching.